Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. When a Hungarian financier called George Soros shorted the English pound 30 years ago, back in 1992, the British government fought back. It did everything it could to preserve the value of its national currency. British officials raised interest rates all the way to 15%. The Bank of England then sold $40 billion of foreign currency reserves in a desperate effort to prop up the pound. In the end, of course, it didn't work. The Bank of England collapsed. Total cost to the population of Great Britain? Well, that's hard to measure, but it was at least £3 billion. This at a time when a pound was worth nearly $2.50. It's now at $1.20, which tells you a lot. So the UK got poorer, but not George Soros. His fund made off with $1 billion in profit, $1 billion, for creating nothing, only destroying things. In the years since, Soros has become richer still, billions and billions of dollars richer. George Soros has become so rich that at this point, Western governments rarely fight back when he interferes in their most basic domestic affairs, the most important domestic affairs. In 2015, for example, Soros decided that Europe had to resettle millions of penniless refugees from Africa and the Middle East. Relatively few Europeans wanted this to happen at all, but George Soros wanted it. So we spent more than $500 million pushing NGOs and European governments to accept what turned out to be a massive wave of human migration. So what happened next? What's the second part of the story? Well, there was a humanitarian crisis. That crisis is still going on. Life in Europe got much worse. Have you been to Paris lately? You should visit. Violent crime, particularly rapes, skyrocketed. And yet, European politicians, many of them funded by Soros, refused to acknowledge it. Look away, they said. This isn't happening. You're crazy or a criminal for noticing. So for the past several years, something not so different has been happening in our country. George Soros has decided to destroy the American justice system. And he's doing it with prosecutors. By this point, fully 1 in 5 Americans, that's more than 70 million people, now live in a jurisdiction overseen by a Soros-backed prosecutor. Soros DAs run cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, our biggest cities. They also run places like Travis County, Texas, and Hinds County, Mississippi, and Loudoun County, Virginia, Chatham County, Georgia. All of them have Soros-backed prosecutors. Soros' influence comes in the form of campaign financing. The money comes from Soros' Open Society foundations and affiliated political action committees and shell companies. A recent analysis by the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund found that in total, more than 75 Soros-backed prosecutors currently hold office in the United States. To get those people in those jobs, Soros has spent more than $40 billion. Often, he's the largest donor in the race. In the race in Philadelphia, for example, 90% of now DA Larry Krasner's financing came from George Soros. Again, what happened next? Drive through Center City, Philadelphia sometime, and you'll see. Soros prosecutors refuse to enforce the law against protected groups. That is their signature quality. That's the heart of their ideology. The result of this has been a lot of posturing, but even more murder victims. A lot of people have died. Last year, Philadelphia recorded its highest homicide total in history. Overall, nationally, according to the FBI, homicides in the United States jumped 30% in 2020. That is the largest single-year increase in murders in American history. All because one billionaire decided that laws American citizens voted for and support were racist. Does that sound like democracy to you? Of course it's not democracy. Democracy is a system in which the will of the majority is recognized and often acted upon. The people rule. What we just described is oligarchy. At best, it's grotesque and has killed a lot of people. You're probably aware of this on some level, and it's frustrating to hear. But until a few hours ago, no one had really done anything about it. But then today, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, a man who, unlike George Soros, has actually been elected by American voters, decided to sack a Soros-backed prosecutor in his state who's been relentlessly politicizing the justice system in Tampa. That man's name is Andrew Warren. For 6 years, Warren has refused to enforce laws that George Soros doesn't like. Today, that ended. Watch.
The prosecutor, state attorney for this judicial circuit, Andrew Warren, has put himself publicly above the law. In June of 2021, he signed a letter saying that he would not enforce any prohibitions on sex change operations for minors. And then most recently, after the Dobbs decision was rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court, he signed a letter saying he would not enforce any laws relating to protecting the right to life in the state of Florida. And mind you, we have had prohibition on third trimester abortions for a long time. When you make yourself above the law, you have violated your duty, you have neglected your duty, and you are displaying a lack of competence to be able to perform those duties. And so today we are suspending State Attorney Andrew Warren effective immediately.
So to be clear, in case you missed civics class, prosecutors don't get to make the laws. Prosecutors enforce the laws. They prosecute people for violating the laws. Legislatures make laws. Your representatives are elected by you to write into law the rules that you support. You get to create the parameters of your own society. That's called democracy. But when a prosecutor decides which laws are valid and which laws are not, that is the most basic subversion of democracy. And Andrew Warren has done that for 6 years. And by the way, the list that Governor DeSantis just read is just partial. Andrew Warren also decided that he would not enforce HB 1. That's a law that increased penalties for rioters. Warren refused to prosecute 67 BLM rioters in the summer of 2020. He said there had been no breach of the peace in Tampa when there most certainly had been. But he decided to ignore it because he agreed with their politics. More recently, Warren declined to prosecute a gang member accused of shooting into a house with children inside after shooting somebody else. Turns out the gang member was oppressed, and of course also likely a Biden voter, so he got a pass. People who aren't Biden voters have had a much tougher time in Andrew Warren's jurisdiction. Sincere Christians, for example. Andrew Warren considers them criminals. 2 years ago, Warren had a Tampa pastor arrested for the crime of holding a church service. And then he bragged about it. Watch.
A defiant Florida pastor arrested for openly, blatantly violating a ban on large gatherings, continuing to hold Sunday church services.
It's not about a virus. It's about the church being a essential service to the community.
Pastor Rodney Howard Brown of the River Church in Tampa is accused of ignoring local safe-at-home orders, encouraging hundreds of parishioners to show up. Howard Brown insists he was within his rights.
Ignore the garbage news coverage. What you have here is a pastor arrested for holding a church service. This is the criminal Andrew Warren decided to prosecute, not the gang member shooting into a building with kids inside. No, a Christian minister reading the Bible in public. Now, as ABC told you, that pastor insists he's within his rights. But there's no insisting necessary in this case. It is prima facie true. If the First Amendment doesn't protect church services, it doesn't protect anything. Of course, this pastor and all pastors are within their rights to preach. There is no adult debate about that. But Andrew Warren didn't care. He doesn't like pastors like that, because pastors like that believe in a power higher than George Soros. So he tried to send that man to jail. Then, in one of the slimiest moments ever caught on videotape, Andrew Warren quoted the Christian Gospels to justify this oppression and abuse. Watch this. It's disgusting.
Putting your parishioners at risk in a time of an emergency like this is not only reckless, but it's illegal. But where people are refusing to obey law enforcement in this regard, you risk being arrested and prosecuted. I'd like to note that I think it's unfortunate that the pastor here is hiding behind the First Amendment. One, it's absolutely clear that emergency orders like this are constitutional and valid. Lastly, I'd remind the good pastor of Mark 12:31. Which says there's no more important commandment than to love thy neighbor as thyself. Loving your neighbors is protecting them, not jeopardizing their health by exposing them to this deadly virus.
It's just disgusting on every level. How dare you, actually? Here you have a law enforcement official telling constituents not to, quote, hide behind the First Amendment by trying to hold church services. That's a right you're born with that cannot be taken away by some Soros-backed prosecutor. Then that same law enforcement official mocks Christians, citing the Bible as a justification for suspending religious freedom. So this is not law enforcement. This is authoritarianism, posing as it. And Warren's not the only one. Dozens of DAs have been trained to do this in law school, and George Soros is funding their campaigns. This is exactly why the nation of Hungary closed a Soros-funded nonprofit in Budapest a few years ago, because it was poison. And now that poison's here in the United States. When Florida's 15-week ban on abortions was reinstated, to name just one example, Andrew Warren announced he would defy the law passed by voters. His reasoning? He would like his daughter to be able to have abortions. Watch this.
We all want abortion to be safe and legal. And now in many parts of the country, in many circumstances, it will be neither. And I know we've been focused a lot on how and where those lines are drawn. 26 weeks or 24 weeks or 15 weeks, but we are missing the fundamental question. It's not where we draw the line, it's who gets to draw the line. I worry about my daughters, about the freedom that's being taken away from them, about the future that we're leaving them. So I'm horrified, I'm upset, I'm disappointed, I'm scared, I'm worried.
Not enough abortions. His daughters, he's crying about it. Who gets to draw the line? Well, actually, we have an answer to that because it's in the Constitution. Voters get to draw the line. Legislatures elected by voters get to draw the line. Prosecutors do not get to draw the line. If they don't like the line, they can resign and go do something else. Go sell aluminum siding or insurance door to door. But they're not allowed to make the laws. But Andrew Warren is not ashamed about any of this. What he is ashamed about is where the money came from that got him elected, the support that he has received from George Soros. We think so, Warren told a reporter when he was asked if his campaign had received cash from George Soros. Quote, we understand that he gave money to the state Democratic Party, and the state party money went to support different candidates, and I have very little insight into the amount of money he gave, who it went to, etc. Oh. But of course that wasn't true, because Warren knew when he said that he had been endorsed by one of Soros's many PACs. It was a PAC called the Color of Change PAC. Warren also knew that many of the 67 BLM rioters he let escape back in 2020 in Tampa were affiliated with this same PAC. Do you see how this works? Kind of a snake eating its tail. Soros sends money to Andrew Warren, then Andrew Warren refuses to prosecute thugs who are also supported by George Soros. That happened in Tampa, but it's happening all over the country. Ron DeSantis is the man who put an end to it today in the state of Florida. We'll be speaking to him in just a moment.